Today's video is sponsored by Sunday Scaries. We've all been there before. We all have dealt with these Sunday Scaries before. Those oh crap, stressful, nervous, can't sleep, dread feelings that hit you on Sunday evenings when you think about work or school tomorrow, or just life in general. Unfortunately, you can feel that same pit in your stomach any day of the week. The Sunday Scaries CBD gummies were made to defeat the crap life throws at us. These are the perfect CBD gummies for professionals on the grind, supermoms, students, party animals, regretful drunk texters, and everyone in between. I don't relax well. I have always been someone that feels like they have to be doing something or accomplishing a task, so it's hard to just shut off my brain and chill. I overthink and I stress myself out. Sunday Scaries are vitamin-boosted CBD gummies that actually work and they chill me out fast. Look, we all have the right to live scare-free. So whether you just need to take the edge off, calm your racing mind, sleep better, or just chill, take 2 CBD gummies every day to keep the scaries away. Let me save you with my 25% discount. Just visit sundayscaries.com and use promo code Mr. Creeps for your discount. That's promo code Mr. Creeps for 25% off at sundayscaries.com. I did not like myself. I knew that there were so many things more important about a person than their physical appearance, and that everyone did stupid things from time to time. But I was just not able to get over my hang-ups. My parents thought that sending me to work in a volunteer program in a national park would help me get my act into gear. I did not want to go, and I told them that straight off. I wanted to stop in my room with the curtains drawn and read horror novels. That was when I was the happiest. And then I saw my father crying in the kitchen. I was shocked. I had always thought of him as a strong man and definitely not the type to show his feelings. I asked my mother what was wrong, and she told me that he was really worried about me. He wanted to help me make something of my life. I mean, they both did. But I kept pushing them away and retreating further into myself. I could see her eyes were filling with tears as well when she told me this. I felt beyond lousy, and after a sleepless night, I told them that I would go and work on the volunteer program and do my best. There was a family hug which made me feel a lot better, and then I went to pack. Not long afterwards, I was on the bus. I lived in a suburb of London, and the bus was soon on the motorway heading north. I had no idea why my parents could have not sent me somewhere closer to home. There was plenty of lovely countryside in the south of England, but they had chosen a national park in the northwest, past the scenic Lake District, where a romance poet had written about daffodils and clouds, and on into a bleak landscape of hills scarred with rocky outcrops. It was July, and when I had left home, it had been a gorgeous day. But as the bus wound its way along the narrow roads that cut through the hills, it felt like I had not just left the motorway behind, but the summer as well. It was so cold. I shivered, retrieved my sweatshirt from my backpack and pulled it on and tried to focus on my book. It was the new paperback from one of my favorite authors. A blood-splattered road trip through a zombie-ravaged world, according to the blurb on the cover, and I had been planning on losing myself in its pages. But I had spent most of the time thinking about my situation at home, and the dawning realization that this trip was just the prelude to me moving on in life properly, away to college or off to work. To be honest, this was a much more frightening prospect than any deranged brain-eater could ever be. When the bus pulled up at the side of the road, I was feeling very down. I was so caught up in my thoughts that I didn't hear the bus driver the first time he called back that this was my stop. When he shouted out again, I felt the eyes of all the other passengers on me as I got my backpack from the overhead rack and walked along the aisle. My cheeks were burning as I watched the bus drive away. It had dropped me off in the middle of nowhere next to a large stone cottage. Apart from the building, there was not another sign of a civilization, just more of the empty hills stretching out as far as the eye could see. I was not even sure that the cottage had counted as civilization. Moss grew in patches over its walls. I could see cracks in its gutters and a good few of its roof tiles were missing. There were no lights visible through its window, and no sign of movement inside. I would have been convinced that the driver had made a mistake and told me to get out at the wrong place. Only there was a sign on the door saying, Park Ranger. I double-checked the email instructions that had been sent by the organizers of the volunteer program, and it said that I was to report to Hillhead Cottage, the park ranger's office, which sounded like the place that I was standing outside of. I peered into one of the windows. There was a laptop on a desk with a couple of maps spread out next to it. An empty cup sat in the middle of one of the maps. I hugged myself. I would have given anything for a hot drink at that moment in time. That and a helicopter ride out of here. I tapped on the window and shouted, "Hello?" And I did the same at the door. But I was met by silence both times. And then I noticed a small laminated note propped inside of another one of the windows. It said that the ranger was out and gave a number to call if you needed assistance. I took out my phone and I keyed in the number. My hands were shaking with a combination of the cold and frustration, so this took an age. It was only when I pressed the call button that I saw that I had no reception. This was the absolute pits, I thought. And then it began to rain. This wasn't the gentle, steady rain that sounded so calming in the background to ambient music. This was heavy, freezing cold drops that hit me in the face. It stung my cheeks and got in my eyes. Within seconds, I was soaked to the skin. Thankfully, a few minutes after the rain began, it had stopped just as suddenly, and a hazy sun appeared. The rain was still dripping off me, but this was a definite improvement. Until the cloud of flies had appeared. They were absolutely tiny, a little more than specks, but it felt like there were thousands of them, and they were all around me. I accidentally swallowed a mouthful and I was standing there spluttering and waving my arms around uselessly when I heard the sound of a car engine approaching. A vehicle that had seen much better days drove into view. Its engine was spluttering worse than me as it came to a halt. A man wearing a green uniform got out, looked at me as the flies continued to buzz around me, and said, "I see you met the locals." And then he smiled and added, "I'm the ranger, you the new volunteer?" I didn't want to risk opening my mouth, so I simply nodded. "I'm sorry I wasn't here to meet you," he went on. "I was heading back when I was flagged down by a couple of visitors to the park who were completely lost. It's easily done around here." Thankfully, the flies were starting to drift off, still moving as one swirling cloud, and I was able to reply, "I am cold, wet, and have never been more miserable in my life. I would like to unvolunteer." He looked sympathetic. "You wouldn't be the first. To be honest, the volunteer program is not very successful. The bus won't be back here until tomorrow. Until then, do you want to come into the office? I'll make up a fire and there's a pizza in the freezer. Shouldn't take too long to cook. Do you like pizza?" My misery levels improving, I followed him inside. The building was surprisingly spacious and clean, and with a log fire crackling in the hearth and the smell of pizza drifting from the oven, I decided that maybe things weren't so bad after all. The ranger had shown me the room that I would be sleeping in. It was a dorm with 4 bunk beds which I would have to myself, and that suited me just fine. There was no TV and my phone still had no signal, but I did have my book. There was a landline phone in the ranger's office. He suggested that I call my parents to let them know that I had arrived, but would be going back home tomorrow. And then he left me to check on the pizzas. As I looked into the address book on my phone so I could dial their number, I started to think of how they would feel when I told them that I had decided not to stay. They wouldn't get angry or shout at me or anything like that. They never had, and I knew they never would. But they would be disappointed, maybe feel sad, maybe feel hurt. As the call was answered by my mother, I made a decision. I told her that the journey had gone well and that the ranger was a nice guy, and how I was looking forward to helping him and learning about what a park ranger did. I had decided to stay. After eating the pizza in record time, I went to bed. I managed to read 2 pages of my book before I fell asleep. I woke up feeling refreshed and enthusiastic to find out what a park ranger did. At home, I would only ever get out of bed before midday if I had to. As the ranger started his car and we set off to begin the task for the day, it was just after 8 a.m. I was in uncharted territory. As he drove, the ranger explained that we would spend the morning repairing a footpath. That sounded great to me. After an hour of carrying and placing stones onto a footpath that never seemed to end, I was aching all over. I had always believed that exercise was for shallow people, that they never had been a problem before, but as I struggled on, I realized that being unfit was maybe not a badge of honor after all. About midday, when we had returned to the car and the ranger passed me a flask of a steaming hot soup and a stack of sandwiches, I found it difficult to unscrew the lid of the flask because my hands felt so weak. "This afternoon will be a lot easier," the ranger said. "I'm working with a university on a study of changing weather patterns, and we placed a monitor at the highest point in the park. Now, if you want to finish your lunch and have a rest, I'll get back to the path." He left me drinking my soup and devouring my sandwiches. I felt guilty that he was doing all the work, but I was grateful as well. He had clearly seen that I was finding it hard going and giving me a break. I appreciated his thoughtfulness. The weather was fine and I had a clear view out over the hills. Where the day before everything had seemed bleak, the landscape now struck me as striking. Compared to the identical housing estates and shopping centers of my hometown, it was almost otherworldly. Sitting there feeling full and warm and comfortable, I started to doze. I woke with a start as the engine coughed itself into life, and I rubbed my eyes and yawned as we set off. We wound our way up a steep path until we had made it to the top of a hill where a small box had been fixed to a pole. The ranger explained the details of how the device worked to me, but I must admit that I was too busy being impressed by the view. From our vantage point, I could see mile after mile of countryside. The park went from striking to stunning in my opinion. Once the ranger had finished entering readings into a notebook, we set off again. I was famished once more, but by now I hoped we were heading back to the cottage. But the ranger had turned to me and said, "I'm going to call in at one of the farmhouses that are situated in the park. There's a half dozen of these and most have been in the same families for generations. Longer actually than the park has been in existence. The farms are a vital part of the ecosystem of the park." He paused here and I could tell that he was thinking. After a moment he continued, "To be frank though, some of the farmers are a pain in the backside. I probably shouldn't say things like that, but it's the truth." "Well, how come?" I asked. "I go and see each of them on a regular basis to discuss the work that I'm doing on the land, but all they ever seem to do is complain. The man that we're going to see today is particularly testy. He's convinced that there's a wild creature in the park and that I should spend all my time trying to catch it." At the words wild creature, a ripple of excitement passed through me. "Like a wolf?" I asked. The ranger shook his head. "There are no wolves in the wild here. The farmer's creature is something a lot more fantastical. Have you heard of cryptids?" "I have," I told him. "Well," he continued, "I side with those who follow these scientific facts and say such things are not real, but I am afraid to say the farmer is letting his imagination run away with him, because he believes there is a barghest roaming these hills. This is a local legend." Much as I loved my horror, I felt the same way about cryptids. I was intrigued all the same, especially because I had no idea what a bar guest was. My head was immediately full of questions, but we were now parking in front of a ramshackle building surrounded by rusty vehicle parts and tires lying on their side. The ranger climbed out and went to knock on the door. 3 knocks later, the door swung slowly open. An old man who looked to be in an even worse state than the scattered junk poked his head out. He did not appear to be pleased to see the ranger and said in a gravelly voice, "You're too late. You could have done something if you would listen to me, but now it's too late." I could tell that the ranger was making an effort to keep his tone reasonable when he replied, "And now then, Nathaniel, what do you mean by that?" The old man's voice rose in volume, and he looked to be shaking with anger. "It was here last night, the creature. I could see it out of my window as I cowered inside in terror. It was lying in front of my door, and you know what that means." And with that, he slammed the door. The ranger sighed and came back to the car. His shoulders were slumped and he pulled his seatbelt back on. I had witnessed the whole thing from the passenger seat and said, "He seems pretty upset." "Yeah," the ranger replied, "and that's not okay. I don't share his beliefs, but I want to help him." He sighed again and then sat up straighter and put a smile on his face. "However, this is not something that you need to worry about. Let's get back to base and have some food. I'll be coming back later to check on the farmer and reassure him that everything is okay, but you can put your feet up." I said that sounded good, but I was already thinking there was no way I was going to stay behind. All the talk of mysterious creatures had sent my imagination into overdrive. After burgers and fries, I persuaded the ranger to let me return with him to the farmhouse. As I stepped outside, I was hit by a rain-laced gale that I began to wish I hadn't, but I wasn't going to turn back. I had committed to something and I was going to see it through. This was who I was now. We set off with the windscreen wipers working overtime and the heater turned to full. As the ranger drove, I picked his brains on what exactly a bar guest was, and though it was clear he did not believe a word of it, his description of a large black dog with piercing red eyes sent a chill through me. When we once again pulled up outside the rundown farmhouse, I was tense and ready to see a monstrous hound lurking outside at the door. Dusk was falling and there were plenty of shadows but no dogs. I was kind of disappointed. The ranger told me to stay in the car and stepped out into the gloom. The rain had stopped by now, but now before turning the ground muddy, and the ranger left a trail of boot marks as he approached the door and knocked. There was a light showing through one of the windows, and when the farmer did not answer the door, the ranger moved around to the window and peered in. I could tell straight away that whatever he had seen was not good because he ran back to the door and began kicking at it, trying to force his way in. The door must have been in as bad a state as the rest of the farmhouse because the wood soon cracked and gave and the ranger disappeared inside. I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but I wanted to help, so I jumped out of the car and hurried towards the open door, but I paused halfway. I had seen paw prints in the mud, and whatever had left them was big and heavy. I went nearer and held the outstretched palm of my hand over one of the paw prints. It was at least a third bigger than my hand. It was getting harder to see because of the encroaching darkness, but I could just about make out a half dozen or so more of the prints heading away from the farmhouse. I once again felt a cold chill. This was nothing to do with the temperature. It was a chill that seemed to be trickling through the marrow of my bones. I hugged myself and wondered if the new committed me was such an improvement after all. And then I heard movement behind me. I spun around and was relieved to see that it was the ranger. A relief that fell away immediately when I saw the serious expression on his face. "Come on," he said. "I'm going to drive you back to the cottage." "What is it?" I asked. "What has happened?" He paused before replying. "It's the farmer," he eventually said. "He's dead." The cold in my bones spread out into my blood and I began to shiver violently. How did he die?" I asked. I don't know, the ranger answered. There are no obvious injuries, so before you ask, it wasn't any kind of wild creature, mythical or otherwise, which is almost a relief, almost. You see, the reason the farmer was saying that it was too late is that a part of the legend of the Burgast is that its appearance on the threshold of somebody's house is a sign that the person is about to die. He shivered as well, and then I saw him try to rally, for my sake, I guessed, and he added in a brighter sounding voice. But that's all nonsense, of course. Nathaniel was an old man and he lived alone. He smoked and drank and he was stressed out. It's very sad, but it shouldn't come as a surprise that he had passed away so suddenly like this. I forced an understanding and sympathetic smile and said, that makes sense. A part of me, though, was imagining a large black dog with red eyes padding away from the farmhouse and leaving its prints in the mud. I was about to tell the ranger about the paw prints when he said, now let's get back. I need to phone the doctor so the proper authorities can start making arrangements. I was happy to get out of there, and we both headed back to the car. But as I did so, I saw something just beyond the farmhouse. A shape which was darker than the night and was staring at me with hideous red eyes. I wanted to shout out to warn the ranger, but I was paralyzed by fear. The ranger had no idea that there was anything wrong and he was climbing into the car. But he wasn't going to make it because the thing that I had seen was racing towards him. It was a dog, but grotesquely large. Its fangs were bared and its eyes ablazed as it sped across the open ground. And still all I could do was stand and watch as it lapped at the ranger. He saw it, but far too late, and the dog had him clamped in between its teeth, and it was snarling and shaking him from side to side. He had seconds left before the dog killed him, and I knew it. I had to break free of my terror. I had to help him. I managed to take a few steps, and I reached down and using both hands, managed to pick up one of the rusty pieces of metal, and then I threw it as hard as I could at the dog. It struck the creature on its side. The dog flinched, its mouth opened, and it dropped the ranger. He fell to the ground. Yeah, take that, I yelled and waved my fist in the air. The dog turned to face me, its eyes burnt into me. I swore, turned around, and began to run. I had no idea what direction I was heading in. I just knew that I had to keep running. It was my only chance to survive. I wanted to look back to see how far away the dog was, but I did not dare. My fevered imagination filled in the blanks. I could see the dog moving with primal ease. It was ready to strike, ready to tear me to pieces. I didn't stand a chance, and my odds were cut to zero when I stumbled and fell. I tumbled over and a sharp pain ran through me as I jolted my elbow on the ground. I came to a halt and sat there gasping for breath. There was a small, fast-flowing river on one side of me, and on the other, the dog. It was standing a few feet away from me, watching me. Drool dripped from its fangs, and in its red eyes, I could see a cold and brutal evil. I was easy prey. I always had been. And I knew those eyes would be the last thing that I would ever see. Until a voice cut through the night. Hey! My heart soared. It was the ranger, and he was still alive. He was behind the dog and staggering towards us. The dog slowly turned its head and looked at him. It was clear that it saw him as no threat as well. I was amazed that he was even able to walk. He was covered in blood, and I could see sickening raw wounds on his chest and arm below his torn clothing. Listen to me, he said. The legend says the Barghest can't cross a river. I couldn't see how such a powerful creature would be held at bay by such a simple thing as a river. But I had learned now that legends could be real. Go, the ranger yelled. I snapped out of my gaze, staggering backwards and into the water. I felt ice cold, and the force of it almost knocked me off my feet. But I managed to keep my balance, and long minutes later, I scrambled to the other side. I lay there struggling to breathe and looked up to see the dog was standing on the other side of the river. I was still fixed in its gaze, but it was holding back, and moments later, it turned and padded away. I sobbed with relief. "It's true," I called out to the ranger. "It can't cross a river." I couldn't see him from where I was, but I was so grateful to him. He had saved my life. And then I heard a scream and a snarling sound. He had saved my life and sacrificed his own. I began to weep. I lay there for a long time, too devastated to move, but eventually I managed to drag myself to my feet and began to walk blindly on. Just before dawn, I stumbled out onto a road, by dumb luck as much as anything else, and after a long, freezing cold wait, a car came into view. I flagged it down and told the driver that I wanted to go home. The day that followed passed in a swirl of doctors and police and social workers and my parents, who traveled up as soon as they were told what had happened. And a search party was sent to look for the ranger and to track down the dog. A week has passed since then, and neither have yet to be found. I know as well that no one believes me about the bar guest. They all think that it's just an ordinary feral dog, driven to become a killer by hunger. But I believe in the legend. I have looked into its eyes and seen it viciously attack. And that night I escaped it. As I stumbled alone and afraid across the bleak hills, I heard its howling call carried on the wind. A sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Thanks for listening to today's video. Show some support for our sponsor, Dave. If you're living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to make ends meet, the holidays may be a really stressful time for you. The stress of not only having to pay for regular bills and costs is worrisome enough, but now add in purchasing presents for loved ones and supplying food for holiday parties, among many other things. For what's supposed to be the happiest time of the year, it can be super stressful, right? But with Dave, you can get your money sooner so you can spend more time enjoying the holidays with your loved ones, not worrying about how much money you have to get through the week. Now, what is Dave exactly? Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. With Dave, there's no interest, late fees, or credit checks. Now, how convenient is that? This allows you to have that extra money in advance, which makes it so much easier to buy those last-minute gifts for family members and friends, plus allowing you to catch up on bills. Those hang-ups that have been stressing you out, you can finally tackle those thanks to Dave. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief that they need with extra cash. So if you're in a pinch and need some extra help, download Dave and think of it as a helping hand from future you. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now or go to dave.com. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve Bank and Trust, member FDIC.